As you can see, we've already got the transmission removed from the vehicle. In a four-wheel drive application like this, some things that you might want to consider are the weight and size of the transmission if you're doing this job on jack stands with a floor jack. The transfer case adds a lot of weight to the back of the transmission and makes it very awkward and unstable for removal. The transmission jack helps stabilize that. Once the transmission is out of the vehicle, an area that you'll want to pay close attention to is in the bell housing area to look for any signs of fluid, maybe from a leaking front seal on the transmission or maybe a leaking rear main seal on the engine. You want to inspect the bell housing and make sure it's clean and dry and that there's not an excessive amount of oil residue that could contaminate the new clutch. Alright, now we're underneath the vehicle after having the transmission removed, and we're going to remove the clutch assembly off of the flywheel. We've got 6 bolts to remove off of the pressure plate, and I'm going to use a small air ratchet or air gun to loosen these bolts. As you get to the last bolt on the pressure plate, you want to make sure that you support the pressure plate so that it doesn't fall once you loosen that final bolt. With the clutch assembly removed, we can inspect it for damage. On this particular vehicle that only has 27,000 miles, this clutch is in pretty good shape, very minimal wear. We're only replacing this clutch as a request to the owner for a series upgrade kit. We're now going to inspect the flywheel on this vehicle. In many cases, at a minimum, the flywheel would need to be removed and reground to ensure a smooth, flat surface for the new clutch plate to seat on. A lot of manufacturers today recommend very small removal specifications. On this particular application, only 3/1000ths of stock is able to be removed from the flywheel before replacement. Next, we're going to undo the 6 19mm bolts that hold the flywheel to the back of the crank flange. We're down to the last bolt. Most flywheels weigh between 30 and 40 pounds, so we're going to want to be able to support the flywheel when we remove this last bolt. Once the flywheel is out of the vehicle, it can be inspected to be decided upon if it makes sense to replace the flywheel or have it reground. In a worn clutch application, many times there will be excessive heat chatter marks on the face of the flywheel that could cause heat cracking. If the flywheel is severely heat cracked, it would make sense to replace it with a new flywheel as opposed to having it reground. Alright, now once the flywheel is removed, we're ready to remove the clutch pilot bearing. In this application, the pilot bearing is in the back of the crankshaft. On many applications, the pilot bearing would come off with the flywheel because it's pressed into the flywheel itself. We're going to use a bearing removal tool to pull the old pilot bearing out of the back of the crankshaft. Many times these tools can be rented from the parts store. Alright, we've got the clutch pilot bearing removal tool installed in the back of the crankshaft, and we're now going to start pulling out the bearing. Here we have removed the old clutch pilot bearing. Alright, we have the old pilot bearing removed, and we're now ready to install the new pilot bearing or bushing. In many AMS clutch assembly kits, you have the option, because they supply both a bronze bushing and a needle bearing. In our case, we're going to use the needle bearing because that's what we removed from the vehicle. Prior to installing the new pilot bearing, you want to make sure that you grease the back side of the bearing prior to tapping it into the back of the crankshaft. To do that, we're going to use a driving tool and a hammer. Once you get the pilot bearing started in the back of the crankshaft, we can then take the driving tool and drive it into the back of the crank until it's fully seated. Since we're installing a series upgrade that consists of a Kevlar lined clutch disc, we've taken our new flywheel and had it precision ground. We removed just 0.02 of stock to ensure a properly flat surface so that the clutch disc will seat properly to the flywheel. Since we've had our replacement flywheel machined, we want to make sure that we give it a thorough washing with hot soapy water to ensure that it's perfectly clean from any contaminants. Alright, now we're ready to install the new flywheel and torque the bolts to manufacturer's specifications. Now we're going to install the flywheel bolts hand tight after putting Loctite on the threads. With the flywheel reinstalled, we're now ready to torque the flywheel bolts to 105 foot-pounds per the manufacturer's specifications. We're using a flywheel holding tool so that we can hold the engine from rotating as we tighten up the bolts. Alright, we're now ready to install the new clutch disc and pressure plate. It's important to orientate the clutch disc so that the clutch hub faces inside the pressure plate during assembly, just like upon removal. Once we take the clutch disc and pressure plate and go to install it, we'll use the clutch kit supplied alignment tool, which will align the splines on the clutch disc with the center of the crankshaft, where this portion of the tool will insert into the pilot bearing that we just installed. Okay, here we've installed the new clutch assembly and we have the alignment tool installed, centering the disc on the pilot bearing, and we're now ready to start the clutch pressure plate bolts into the flywheel. Once we install the clutch pressure plate bolts finger tight, we'll tighten them down evenly, pulling the fingers of the pressure plate down against the disc in an even fashion. Okay, now once the bolts have been installed by hand, we're tightening them down in a crisscross fashion so that it draws the fingers of the pressure plate down evenly. Alright, now we're ready to torque the pressure plate to the manufacturer's specifications, which on this application is 37 foot-pounds. We want to torque the pressure plate in the same crisscross fashion that we installed it in. And then we can remove the clutch alignment tool. Alright, we're now ready to switch to the transmission to service the release bearing. In order to remove the release bearing from the transmission, we'll slide it off the transmission collar and pull the pivot ball off the inside of the bell housing, and then slide the assembly off. Once the throwout bearing arm is off, we can inspect the pivot ball for any wear and replace the clip if there's any damage to the clip. We'll also look at the transmission collar and make sure there's no scoring on the collar, which is where the throwout bearing slides back and forth on the pivot arm. Alright, with the new throwout bearing installed, we're now ready to reassemble the clutch fork. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on the pivot ball, and I've already added some grease to the transmission collar, just a light coat to prevent any excess from getting on the new clutch disc. We can install the throwout bearing on the transmission collar and push it onto the pivot ball and make sure that it moves freely without binding. And we're now ready to reinstall the transmission into the vehicle. Now that we've reinstalled the transmission, we're ready to lower the vehicle down and take it for a test drive. There's a burnish procedure required for the series upgrade Kevlar disc that we've installed that is 3 to 5 times longer than a normal clutch disc. Within the 100-mile test drive, it's important to be sure that we don't slip the clutch and burn the flywheel with the Kevlar disc.